Before we begin, a content warning. Please note that this podcast may contain some material that listeners might find upsetting.
You're listening to an IOE podcast from the UCL Institute of Education. Powered by UCL Minds.
On the 25th of May, 2020, an African American man named George Perry Floyd Jr. was killed as police pinned him down for 8 minutes 46 seconds in Minneapolis in the United States. His death was captured on camera, and his repeated cries of "I can't breathe" have become etched in the minds of many. This brutal act, described by historian David Olusoga as a 21st century lynching, sparked a wave of protests across the United States and shortly after around the world, including here in the United Kingdom. I'm Dr. Humera Iqbal, and I'm a lecturer in psychology at the Department of Social Science at the UCL Institute of Education. Britain is not a society that is free from racism, particularly towards Black communities. Indeed, much of the wealth and prosperity of this nation has been built on the back of colonialism and that of slavery. So, protests did take place. And while protesting is not new, as Angela Davis says, this time we are seeing new demands for change.
We're asked now to consider how we might imagine justice in the future. This is a very exciting moment. I don't know if we have ever experienced this kind of global challenge to racism and to the consequences of slavery and colonialism.
Today, I want to introduce you to three students who are studying at the IOE and UCL Faculty of Laws to share their experiences of being young, Black, and British. We have Gian, a final year social science BSc student who is calling in from London. Hello, Gian.
Hello.
We have Afia, a third year Bachelor of Law student who is calling in from Manchester. Hi, Afia.
Hello.
And Jonathan, who's finishing his PhD at the IOE's Department of Education, Practice and Society, calling in from Paris. Bonjour, Jonathan.
Bonjour.
Thanks, each of you, for being here today. This is not going to be an easy conversation, but it will be an important one, and we want to give you this platform to make your voices heard. I want to start all by asking you a little bit about yourself, and also want to ask you what Blackness means to you. So perhaps we'll start with Gian.
For me, as a final year student, I'm doing my dissertation, and so when you ask me what Blackness means to me, it's actually been something that I've been contemplating for the past year, because my dissertation is actually on cultural appropriation and in popular culture, so cultural appropriation and how sort of that represents Blackness and how Blackness sort of integrates and intersects with different aspects of cultural appropriation that have been quite preeminent in a lot of conversations online and things like that. So for me, I've been doing quite a lot of research on what Blackness is, and from what I have sort of gathered from my research and stuff like that, I think Blackness is African diaspora, as that's one way that somebody has put it. And I think that is quite a impactful way of looking at it, because Blackness has been created out of shared experiences of injustice and displacement, but also through this like mutual appreciation of each other's art and music and people that have been displaced from Africa, and then how that has sort of resonated with them throughout their time in sort of different Western cultures, I would say, and how that's contributed to their culture and their art and their music, and then that sort of falls under this umbrella of Blackness. And I think it is somewhat of a problematic term, but is also something that is really empowering and impactful.
Thank you, Gian. Jonathan, do you want to add?
I really what Gian had to say about the diaspora really resonates with me. So I think that's what it means. It's about being part of a diaspora, that shared experience of adversity But also, one of the things that I think of is resilience. And resilience is a problematic concept in itself. I don't think we should always ask people who suffer to be resilient, but it's one of the kind of threads I think that run through the Black experience. So, I was listening to some hip hop when I was out running this morning, and how much of Black music is about overcoming adversity is something that really I see as being quite central to the Black era.
And Afia, I mean, what do you think about what Jonathan says? Being a law student as well, this aspect of kind of resilience.
I really echo what has been stated already. And I think for me personally, growing up with Ghanaian and Jamaican heritage, I've been really conscious of the richness in culture that I've been exposed to. And regarding resilience, I think Blackness is about, as Jonathan said, overcoming struggle, facing pain, and bouncing back from setbacks and challenges in a way that is unique to the Black community. And it's about never shying away from who you are, standing out even if you seem to be or are the odd one out.
The aspect of standing out and standing up, I think it kind of ties into my next question, which is about protest and movement. And I wonder, why do you think that it's taken now for kind of not just kind of for all communities to stand up? And why is it that events in the US have caused movements and protests across the world, in the UK, Australia, and France? Why has it taken George Floyd's death for this to happen? Why now?
I think regarding George Floyd's death, it wasn't an isolated incident. And even within the weeks leading up to his murder, there were other deaths caused by police brutality. So the cry and the anguish of the Black community stems from years and decades of pain. And it's reached its peak after the world has witnessed this horrific atrocity. And so I think for the Black community, it was very much a sense of we are tired and we are grieving. And for non Black people, there was an awakening as to how awful the situation is. And recognition of that has sparked protest and outrage. I think people are realizing that this is not just an American issue, that overt racism and covert racism exist in many societies. That's why you're seeing demonstrations throughout the globe.
Jonathan, you wanted to add?
Yeah, and I would totally agree with that. And I think one of the reasons why something that happens in the United States causes anger everywhere is part of that idea of Blackness, right? And it's partly an embodied experience. So that when I see people who share the same skin color as me, no matter how different those people might be from me, I think it sparks something in me, quite a visceral reaction. And I suppose that's would be my main explanation for why someone in France might see what's happening with George Floyd and feel like it's relevant to them.
Gian?
I've been asking myself the question of why now? And I think there's just been a growing sort of collective frustration amongst the Black communities across the world, but also non-Black communities who are recognizing Black communities and the struggle and injustice that they've been facing, and linking it to the establishment and sort of government policies and politics that haven't been friendly towards Black communities and other sort of BAME communities. And that includes sort of Brexit and the hostile environment and things like that. And that has sort of sparked lots of conversations of what it means to be British, what it means to be, part of a certain nationality and how that intersects with your race. And I think a lot of people are realizing that the preconceptions people have of what race is and what Blackness is needs to be addressed and needs to be discussed more and needs to be put into sort of education and academia. But they are concepts that are so ingrained in our society, and yet they're not discussed, or they're sort of not taught, at a very basic education level. And I think people are just frustrated that there's so much of their history that isn't being shared and isn't being discussed, that now I think a lot of the backlash against certain, politicians or politics is also sort of becoming part of the Black Lives Matter movement.
Gian, it's interesting you used the term BAME, Black and Minority Ethnic, which is kind of a kind of umbrella term. I wonder, Jonathan, if you and Gian, you too, do you have any opinion on the use of this term BAME?
I think it has its uses. I think it has its uses in the sense that fight against racism, different forms of racism, like there's a certain convergence, isn't there? And there's a certain sharedness in the experience.
I agree with Jonathan. I think often people think that it's a simple grouping together of people. I think that when organizations and companies are seeking to address racial issues, as Jonathan said, there are many shared experiences. And by using the umbrella term BME, I think you're able to cater to the needs of different groups. And recognizing the fact that we are a minority, the UK is 86% white, I think BME accurately portrays the situation that currently exists.
Okay, really, really interesting. Personally, I don't know. I think I find the term quite problematic. And I don't know, I think it's something about categorization and being labeled, BAME. It's kind of such a cluster.
Yeah, I would agree with what you've said. I do think that the BAME or BME category is useful to some extent, but I do think it's over essentialized in terms of it, especially when it comes to things like hiring or, with the current COVID-19 pandemic, when they discuss BAME people being more susceptible, more likely to die because of COVID-19. I think that it is problematic when looking at those experiences all as a collective, when Black people have very different experiences to people from other minority ethnic backgrounds, Asian backgrounds, and there's very different experiences across just even the Black experience as well. So I think that it is problematic to sort of make an umbrella term that doesn't necessarily appreciate all those different experiences and how discrimination affects those different groups, and looking at the intersections of that. And I think that having a BAME category can be useful when looking at sort of political Blackness and what that meant back in the day, when having done research thinking that political Blackness has been more prevalent after sort of post-war migration, that slowly sort of died down now after we have achieved sort of certain race relations acts and stuff like that. But I think that even though that was a useful term then and is a useful way of organizing and a useful way of identifying that we all have shared experiences which do need to be addressed and do need to sort of bring people together, I do think it is problematic in itself as well. So it's a really hard term to sort of use and look at because it's being used by sort of companies and employers, but not necessarily in the way it should be.
Just following on from that statement, I think the term itself isn't dangerous, but it's subject to a lot of abuse. And it's used in a way that is a box ticking exercise. And that's why it's become problematic. And I think if it was used in the correct way, it would be less of an issue. But from what we've seen in terms of company policy, they're putting together a group of people to try and tick a box. And that wrongful use of the term has caused negative connotations to arise.
I agree with all of that, but I think that the term Black also has the same problem. So I think sometimes it feels most appropriate in a certain situation to say I am from an ethnic minority. Sometimes it feels appropriate to say I'm Black. Sometimes it feels appropriate to say I'm Jamaican or second generation Jamaican. I think it depends on the situation.
You all make really good points. I want to bring it back to actually talking about protests because this is all linked. And why is protest important? And what were your reflections in seeing the images, this past few weeks or being part of the movement? Kian?
I attended a Black Lives Matter protest recently, and for me, protest has always been a powerful way of showing the world how strong a movement is, because when you just see everyone that comes out in sort of solidarity and are making demands quite publicly, I think it shows the strength of those demands. And for me, when I went to the protest, it was such an amazing experience to see so many people from so many different backgrounds, ages, come together. And when we did the march, we marched across London, we marched to Victoria Station and then down to Vauxhall to where the US Embassy was, and we saw people in their houses and they would come to the windows and they'd see us marching and they'd see that we had a lot to say and we were there collectively as a movement and something that they could join or something that they could see was a problem or an issue that needs to be addressed.
Hands up! Hands up! We gon' be alright. We gon' be alright. We gon' be alright. No peace. No peace! Stop killing the man! Stop killing the man! Stop killing the man! Stop killing the man! Stop killing the man!
And I think that is one of the most important things of protests, is to make sure that you're raising awareness and making your voice heard, but also having certain demands as well, such as, no justice, no peace, in terms of demanding social justice. And I think that's one of the most important things of protests, because there are other means of achieving those ends, but a lot of those ends don't get completed because they are not made loud enough. And I think protest is a way of demonstrating how collective people are and how like-minded people are about certain issues.
For me, the protests were significant because part of the decision to go was based on the coronavirus itself. And I've literally been at home for the last 10 weeks. I haven't been out a lot. And so even making the decision to go to the protest was, for me, significant in and of itself. And I thought, what would cause me to leave my home and place myself in a position of risk? And that was something that was even more important in the moment. So I attended a march in Manchester, and it was a really powerful moment. The power of unity in a diverse community coming together to make a stand on a really significant issue. And then all of us kneeling in silence in remembrance of George Floyd. It was a real pivotal moment. And in Manchester specifically, there wasn't an obvious police presence. So there were no boarded shops, there was no violence, looting, or rioting. It was just a peaceful protest, and it was incredible. And I think taking part in a historical moment like that is something that I will remember and take with me for the rest of my life.
Jonathan, you've been in France, and the situation, there's been protests there as well. Do you want to share kind of something about your experiences?
Sure. So there was one last Tuesday, which was banned. People still went out. I didn't go in the end. They're doing another one on Saturday, so I'll go along to that. And I think a couple of things to jump on what's been said so far. I think protest is a way of getting things done. So to give you the example of France, these protests happened last week, and almost straight away it's unblocked. There's a particular case of Adama Traore, and his family have been at loggerheads with the state for the past 2 or 3 years since he's died in police custody. And all of a sudden, after the protests, the government now want to meet with the family, whereas they'd refused to meet with them before. Particularly powerful in that regard is what happened in Bristol. You know, the campaign to remove that statue has been in place for such a long time, and it took direct action for it to make that happen. So it just makes me think that when people aren't listened to, like the Adama Traore's family were not listened to for so long, they can express themselves through other means. It's really important for people of colour.
Jonathan, it's interesting you brought up the point about kind of the statue that was taken down. And I wanted to ask actually each of you, I mean, what do you think about moving of statues and renaming streets? Is this enough, or is it just a first step? Afia?
I would say that it's a good start, and it's recognition of the atrocities that have happened before. But I think it's more of a symbolic stance, and it doesn't really address the systemic behaviors that continue to exist. So I think it is a good start, but more needs to be done.
Kian?
I think a lot of people criticize these acts as performative or not really, or sort of detracting attention from the main issues. But I think that when you have a statue that has been in a city for years and years, and it's been sort of a central part of that city or a landmark, and it becomes ingrained in the history of a city, I think it is right to have the opportunity to challenge that history and to challenge what the symbolism of those statues mean. And I appreciate that it is symbolic, but it symbolizes so much. So I definitely think that taking down statues and other things that do represent sort of the history of slavery and colonialism and the empire are some ways of sort of bringing that history to people that don't necessarily know that, or a way of just establishing discussion and a narrative over what those sort of statues mean as a part of history. And I think that that's so important to have those discussions and make sure that those statues are taken down or moved to a museum possibly, where they can be properly discussed rather than used as a landmark that you just accept. You know, going to sort of museums and things like that, where I've seen so many paintings of slave ships and captains, and they're revered and they're, well decorated, but yet there's no real sort of sense of the history behind who those people are, what they've done. And instead of being revered, maybe they should be sort of criticized and condemned for what they've done. So I think it is good to have those sort of narratives and discussions.
I guess symbols, imagery, language, they carry so much power. Jonathan, I can see you want to jump in.
Yeah, I totally agree with what's been said. I think it's really, like, memory and history are an important domain. So I think in terms of how we remember things, how we view our history and our relationship to our history, I think these statues are important. Removing them is one way of doing it. Creating a context to those statues, maybe by having statues of slaves in front of them or a plaque that explains some of the context, is another way of approaching that. At the same time, memory and history is just one domain related to the racial legacy. So we need to take action in other areas too.
I want to move on to the next question I have because, I mean, Jonathan, you have experience of being a teacher, and I wanted to know, actually, I want to ask all of you about what you learned about race, slavery, and colonialism at school. Do you think there's enough? That you learned enough? Is there enough in the curriculum?
I don't really have any memory of learning about slavery or colonialism until I got to university, and until I started really, well, like when I started educating myself, I suppose, through fiction, was my way in. But I don't really remember like learning about the empire or slavery or really important facts about where my parents are from, Jamaica, which was, part of the empire. So that was me back then. My experience as a teacher and studying education is there have been several points where we've been on the brink of having a curriculum that fully talks about Britain's history in its fullest sense. So many wasted opportunities on that front, I think. And unfortunately, I just think it's something that's never broken through. You get moments and then there's always a step back. And, you take one step forward, two steps back is probably the best way of summarising that for me.
I mean, I remember learning about the Industrial Revolution, but I mean, it was only when I moved to another country I learned about colonialism as well. So, there is something to be said. Afia, I can see you had something to add.
Yeah, so during my high school years, we learnt about Black history, but the focus was heavily on the transatlantic slave trade and the civil rights movement in America. And there was very little information. Actually, there was no information about Black British history or colonialism or racism in the UK. And so I've had to educate myself on instances like the Bristol bus boycott, or even the fact that people of colour served as soldiers in the world wars. And I think it's a real shame that this issue of racism has been placed in the American context. And not just Black British kids, but kids generally in Britain are understanding the systemic issues that have happened over decades. So I think, as Jonathan said, change needs to come to the curriculum. I could reel off, in fact, the 6 wives of Henry VIII, but I couldn't tell you in-depth knowledge about Black British history. And I think that's a real shame, and that ought to be remedied.
So well put, Kian.
I was in an American school when I was growing up, or a part of when I was growing up, and I remember being taught quite heavily about slavery and as it relates to their constitution, because the American Constitution plays such an important part, and you're taught about the American Constitution when you're quite young, so in primary school even. And I remember being taught about the 13th Amendment and the abolition of slavery. But in terms of a British context, when I then did go to a British education system, I transferred to a British school, it became so much more clear to me that there's very few discussions in the British education system about Britain's role in the slave trade and how Black British people came to Britain, and also how British people went to other countries and colonized them. And I think that is a really, really essential part to understand Britain's history and understand why the empire was so big, how it became so big, and how Britain became so prosperous. And yet it's such a small aspect, even probably there was very little or next to nothing in the curriculum about it. And I remember, we learned about the Normans and the Romans, and then it would just jump all the way to the World Wars almost, and then a little bit of the Industrial Revolution, but there's so much in there that hasn't been explained. And I think it is detrimental to not just Black students, but also to the non-Black students who are in a very multicultural society, especially within, cities, but don't understand how those cities have come about. And I think it's a real shame. And I do think that the education system does need to do better in terms of explaining how Britain did expand its empire, and also even how the British people were the ones that went to America and established America, and how that has all unfolded. And I think that for me personally, but a lot of other people that I've spoken to, they've learned about slavery and the history of Black people through American sort of literature and TV shows and books. I remember that my dad made me watch Roots when I was young, and sort of they made me discuss how I felt about that series. And I really didn't understand that context because I'm not American, but I've sort of placed myself in this American context that I'm not part of.
Jonathan?
I just wanted to jump on one thing Gian said, that you only have to listen to some of the foolishness on TV or on Twitter, some of the things that people are saying right now about the removal of statues to show that, like Gian said, it doesn't just benefit Black British people to learn about this history. There are a lot of white people that have got a lot to learn about their own history and Britain's role in the world. I've been shocked by some of the things, the ignorance that I've heard. People's ignorance about their own country and its history has really bowled me over in the last couple of weeks.
And like what Afia's just said about, the contribution of people of colour to the war, and the fact that they're, for example, my own grandfather was in the British Army, like he contributed, but you don't hear about, the contribution, of minority or people of colour to this great, war and this struggle. So, I mean, it's a really great point that you all make. And actually also coming back to what Gian said about watching Roots and kind of the fact that your parents spoke about race with you. I wonder, each of you, how was race discussed amongst your friends and family? Or was it discussed or was it not discussed? Can you share?
It's interesting. Like my parents aren't very political. I think they'd be the first to admit that. I have older brothers who had their experiences with the police growing up, I suppose. Probably experience, because of the age gap, they probably experienced a lot more direct racism than I did. So I feel like a lot of my learning came from them. I think my parents' generation, I think they probably see themselves as Jamaican first and Black second because they're first generation immigrants. So I think the conversation in our household or my conversations with them are really inflected with that experience. So, for example, they don't really talk about white people as being white. They always say English. Like when they say English, so they mean white, right? So that's kind of where they're at.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think my dad has always been quite a key figure in terms of helping me understand race and racism in the world. And as I said, he made me watch Roots, but then he also had those discussions with me. And I was quite young at that time and I really didn't understand. I thought it was a really horrible film. And then he had to sort of explain, no, this is based on, well, it's based around true events. Obviously, it wasn't a true story, but it was based on narratives that are real. And I think that a lot of learning also comes from school in terms of the bullying that you receive and sort of understanding the microaggressions and bullying that you receive about, your hair texture and why you have to put your hair in a certain way, or just the different words that are said. And then obviously with some of the music that has come out and, the use of the N-word, it is when you're sort of learning about those exchanges and those conversations and how you sort of integrate with other people. And that's when I sort of learned more about racism than I've ever learned from school. So I think that my parents did, my mum as well also would always talk to me about whenever I had questions, she'd try and answer them. But I think that it's more the exchanges that you have with friends and family that have had to give people the narratives of what racism is than I think the education system does. And I think that I've heard lots of people, talk about when they have to give their kids the talk about how they could face or they do face discrimination and injustice in the society. And I remember it actually being one of the narratives or topics on EastEnders, which was actually quite powerful for me. And when a father had to sort of sit down his daughter, his black daughter, and say, there's all these different things in the world that mean that you might not have the opportunities or the chances or be not seen for your talent or your sort of your goals and more on just the color of your skin. And I think that it was such an impactful moment on television. And I think that those are sort of the conversations that some parents have with their children. And it is a big talk and a big issue. And I don't think that a lot of parents are given enough tools and enough support to be able to have those conversations with kids.
Gian, I really agree with you. That clip from EastEnders where Mitch talks to his daughter Bailey about race was really impactful.
At school, one of the teaching assistants was trying to plait my hair, but she couldn't. She could only plait the white girl's hair.
It's not only about that stuff. I mean, sometimes you might get called some real nasty names.
I'll just avoid people who say those kind of things. You don't need to worry, Dad.
Maybe the older you get, it's just not that simple.
Afia, did you want to add?
My parents have always been passionate about looking back on history to firstly appreciate where we've come from, but also take lessons from the past. And so I've been raised on books and films featuring Steve Biko, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, to understand the Black struggle and how that impacts my life today. And so I think race has always been something my parents haven't shied away from. That's not to make me look at the world cynically, but to understand how the world may perceive me. And then from that, understanding actually how to embrace your blackness, how to embrace who you are, how to have these open conversations with people to ensure that the mistakes and the tragedies that happened in the past aren't repeated. So I'm very grateful for my parents' approach, because I think I've understood not just racism in the UK, but in South Africa and in America. So I'm understanding the Black struggle throughout the globe.
When the Windrush scandal happened in the UK, because if we're talking about history in the past and discussions, did you have conversations with your families? Were there changes in how you felt about Britain?
Yeah, so my late great grandparents were of the Windrush generation. And so when the scandal unfolded around 2018, it was a real shame and embarrassment to watch. And so I thought about history, and I thought about how actually, when we go to the root of it, the people from the Caribbean were first taken as slaves to the Caribbean. Then, once freed, they weren't compensated. Then their men came and served in both world wars, but were treated as inferior to their white counterparts. And then after the Second World War, they were invited over to rebuild this nation because of labor shortages. And they had a legal right to come and weren't given formal documentation. And then decades later, were treated as illegal immigrants. And I thought it was a real embarrassment on the part of Britain to shun this group of people who have been invited over, but also helped to rebuild the country after it was devastated by the war. And so Windrush the scandal symbolizes the ruin of lives and the sending back of people who never actually called the Caribbean home. They were born and raised in Britain. And after that, haven't even been adequately compensated. So when I think about Windrush and the scandal that's come from it, I it's really hard not to get angry and frustrated by the situation.
Jonathan, did you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was really well put. I think it was a very, very shameful incident in itself that reflects a really, really shameful past. And I think Afia put it really well there, that something that happens in the present kind of brings up all of these things from the past, these memories, right? One of the things that shocked me in particularly at the time as well was the amount of people that were caught up in the scandal that have been in this country for so long without any documentation. Like, that was a real, like, you know, the large numbers of people that were in that situation. That was something that was a real shock to me. Particularly shocked me that to think about some of those people can't have even been back to the Caribbean or ever been to the Caribbean in that time because they never had a passport. And it just made me think of the deprivation and the poverty that goes along with that, right? And how many people from Caribbean backgrounds don't even have a passport? Like, that was one of the things that's really stayed with me.
Jonathan, when you talk about belonging and citizenship, that makes me think of Black by Dave.
Walking for their water daughter wrapped inside a bed sheet. Black is distant, it's representing countries that never even existed while your grandmother was living. Black is my Ghanaian brother, reading into scriptures, doing research on his lineage, finding out that he's Egyptian. Black is people naming your countries and what they trade most. Coast of Ivory, Gold Coast, and the Grain Coast. But most importantly, to show how deep all of this pain goes. West Africa, Benin, they call it Slave Coast. Black is so confusing, cause the culture they're in love with it. Take our features.
Yeah, my granddad was part of the Windrush generation. He's actually on my mum's side, and he's Indo-Guyanese, so he's not black, but still, nonetheless, he was a part of the Windrush generation. And he has always said that he's never felt quite at home in Guyana and never felt quite at home in England after moving to England. And it's just, it raises so many questions about identity and belonging. And I think the Windrush scandal really just emphasized that, in terms of where do you really belong, and how people in England who have lived here and worked here, pay their taxes, contribute to so much and have helped rebuild Britain and keep helping Britain in its prosperity, being seen as others and being seen as people that do not belong here. And it's a constant battle. Go to certain places where you do feel like you don't belong. I mean, I know a lot of my family members refuse to go to the suburbs of Britain because they just think, what is the point of me going and seeing aspects of different cities where I could face abuse or racism, harassment for the colour of my skin? And that sense of not belonging and feeling like you're always inadequate or always going to be judged is a constant fear. And I think Windrush just really showed that these fears are just, and these fears are a really big part of the experience of being Black and British in Britain.
So when other people who are not Black say they're worried about saying the wrong thing, what would you tell them? I mean, I hear reality, but it's upsetting and it needs to change. And I guess with the protest, there's a hope that there's a momentum for change. And this is one of the things that has come up. People saying who are not Black saying they feel uncomfortable, they're not sure, they don't want to put their foot in it. What would you say to them?
So the first thing I would say is if racism is systemic, then we need to not individualize our reactions to it. And I think that takes the pressure off the individual, right? And I think it's impossible to exist outside of racism. And I think that's the first step to understanding the problem. We're all on a bit of a journey. We all grew up in a world that was racist, so we can all say the wrong things at the wrong time. I could say something that was offensive to someone who's Jewish or someone who's Asian, because I don't understand. I think the people that you sometimes feel like the people that you've got to watch out for are the people that would argue that they are never racist and that they are never going to make those mistakes, because it just shows a degree of ignorance or denial.
Afia?
I think if you are sincere in your intentions and you don't have an agenda, I would encourage non-Black people to lean into any sense of awkwardness and just listen and learn. And I think the danger is people assume that Black people and their Black friends don't want to be burdened by your inquisitiveness. But actually, if you go with an open mind and you're not defensive in your tone, you can have really open and educating conversations. People want to be heard, and Black people want to talk about their experiences. And if they know they have a willing ear, they are willing to share. I would say have those open conversations. Don't assume that people don't want to engage with the issue, and go with an open mind. And then maybe you can come from that reflecting on how you can make a change in society.
Kian?
I've been seeing a lot of different resources and reading lists and documentaries and things that are being listed as things that non-Black people can look at to learn more and educate themselves. And I think that just wanting to learn more is the stepping stone of being able to address the problem of like, what if I say something wrong, or what if I do something wrong? And I think that a lot of it is about having to sort of do the work yourself and making sure that you research and read books and are engaging with a diverse range of literature or media. And for me, especially when referring to my dissertation on cultural appropriation, there's a lot in the sense of cultural appropriation being an adoption of, specifically, I'm looking at Black culture by non-Black people, and using, whether it be in fashion or music or art, adopting styles that were traditionally seen as sort of created by Black people, and white people sort of using those similar styles. And I think that it is important for people to do the research into what the meanings and symbolism of different things are before adopting or using those things, and understanding that there are much wider meanings and symbolisms to hip-hop music. It's not just a sort of way of speaking or way of doing music. There's a storytelling aspect to it. There is, as mentioned, an aspect of resilience that non-Black people might not understand. And I think that it is about asking people, engaging in conversations. And I know in the UK there are a lot of places where there just are not a lot of Black people to ask. And I definitely think that with the internet now, it is a source of fake news, and there is a lot of negative aspects to it, but there's also so much positive way of finding information. And as I think Jonathan said, I could also say the wrong thing. Like, I'm always in fear that I'm saying the wrong thing, even about, Black people. So none of us are experts, and I don't think we should be treated as if we are experts of a whole culture or a whole generation of people. I think that it's all a learning process over a course of my life, really, and our lives. So I think it's worth noting that as well.
Mm-hmm. So we need to have self-awareness, we need to listen, and we need to educate ourselves. These are steps that, people need to take. I want to move on now to your time at UCL and the IOE. And I want to ask you some questions about your experiences here in the IOE and UCL. Do you think your voice is heard? Do you feel welcome? Afia?
So, from my experience within my faculty, I've met personally with the BME officer, and I've had really great conversations about race and what needs to be done to improve the Black student experience at UCL, specifically within laws. And in addition to that, I've participated in a focus group to give voice to the issues faced by BME students. So I think that from my point of view, UCL has been proactive in trying to get a sense of how Black students feel and try and find tangible and effective ways to address the issues that are faced. Now, I think obviously more can be done and more will be done, as has been promised, but I'm optimistic about what UCL will put forward in future.
Jonathan?
And maybe I come at it slightly differently because of my age as well. Like, I feel like I've been in so many majority white spaces since I was an undergraduate student that it just becomes something that I get used to. And, it's like water, like if you fish in water, you never really notice the water's there to a certain extent. If I could say one thing, I think that one thing that can make a difference at the IOE and other universities as well is having more Black decision makers within the institution. We have a real problem. I was a teacher for 12 years, and throughout the whole time, there was this discussion about the lack of Black people in school leadership. And then I go back to university and find that there's exactly the same problem in the leadership of universities as well. And I think that's one of the things that would make a huge difference. Because being Black is such an embodied experience, I think that I'm not going to say that automatically Black decision makers will make decisions in the best interests of Black students. But I do think that Black decision makers come at a problem in a slightly different way. So I think that's a really important vehicle for change.
Gian?
I think, firstly, the distinction for me between IOE and UCL is hard to sort of make as a student. So when you ask about IOE, because I am a UCL student and I pay my fees to UCL, I don't really see many distinguishments between the two. But I do think that, specifically at IOE, given that it's mostly a lot of humanities and teaching degrees that are being taught through the IOE, and there's a strong focus on education and the social sciences, I think that there is definitely not just a lack of Black people within like the student body and management and teaching departments, but I think, especially Black men are not as frequent in the IOE building, I would say, as very, to put it very bluntly, I don't think, apart from security guards, do I see many Black men engaging in a lot of the discussions and coming to a lot of the meetings and a lot of the sort of activities arranged by the IOE specifically. And then, on a broader UCL sense, I do think that there is a lot more work that needs to be done in sort of encouraging Black academics to join teaching departments and encouraging more diverse reading lists. And I remember it can be challenging to walk in and be the only Black person in the room. And then, especially with the social sciences degree, where we are talking about race and sort of discrimination and injustice. As I said, I'm not an expert, but sometimes I'm treated that way. I'm very happy to talk about my experiences, but I think that it comes at a sense that I am sort of the speaker of all Black people, and Black people have had the same experiences that I have had, when that is completely wrong, because my experience, I am quite privileged. I have traveled and I've done a lot of things that, make me a very interesting individual that not necessarily other Black people would have had those same experiences. So I think that it is important to have more Black voices and have more Black consultants, and also have less academic focus, because I do feel like academia sometimes has a barrier in terms of the way in which we speak and the way in which we are expected to present our ideas and write, that excludes certain people and certain experiences and ways of speaking and dialects. And I think that that's an issue, and I would definitely say that all of that needs to be addressed. And I actually looked up a few statistics from the research that I did, that even though Black and Asian students are more likely to go to university than white people, they don't necessarily come out or attain the same sort of grades. And I think there's got to be investigations as to why that is. I think Black students are much less likely to achieve a first in comparison to white students. And, the levels of attainment and the levels of engagement of students that are from, Black backgrounds or BAME backgrounds needs to be addressed from a top-down approach at universities as well as a bottom-up approach.
Mm-hmm. Afia, did you want to add?
Yeah, I was just going to echo what has been said. I think regarding the attainment gap, that's something that is clear within a lot of the institutions in the UK, not just UCL. And I think what I would like to see, and I think what a lot of people would like to see, is how the university will deal with that practically, how it will actually remedy that gap that is evident in statistical research. And also, just following what Jonathan said about Black decision makers, there's been a noticeable lack of Black academics in, I think, most departments. And so I know with laws, they're trying to provide a pipeline by giving scholarships and things like that for master's and PhD programs. But I think there needs to be a real awakening to the fact that we as Black students are not seeing ourselves in the teaching. We're not seeing ourselves in the staff. And that can be not off-putting per se, but it can be discouraging if you were seeking to follow that career. So I think that's something that ought to be looked at, and for accountability purposes, a practical proposal put forward so people know actually real steps are going to take and this isn't just a promise.
I hear you, Afia. I think you make such an important point. And there's also something to be said about, as a student wanting to have a mentor or having someone, that you feel you might share your experiences with, to be able to speak with, not just in an educational capacity, but, in a pastoral capacity as well. Because as academics, as lecturers, our job is not just to, deliver content and material, it's to act as a support for students. If you can't draw from shared experiences, sometimes it makes it, is something that needs to be addressed. Gian.
Yeah, I just wanted to also add that I think that a lot of the research and theories on racism and Blackness and identity and Black identity are done by American researchers and academics, and then are translated to British experiences and Black British people.
Mm-hmm. Jonathan, did you want to add?
Yeah, just want to add one thing. Having said that, like, I've got so used to being in all white spaces, the times where I am most surprised that I'm in most all white spaces is when I attend conferences that are on the theme of migration studies, right? And it's people that like study migration, and I'll be the only Black face in the room. And I just like, it just, I suppose it points in the direction that we need to go, right? We need more people of color studying issues around migration, but across the disciplines as well.
Is there a Black scholar or writer whose work you particularly admire, who you think our listeners should read up on?
I'm going to go for Stuart Hall. He writes about a lot of areas that I'm interested in. So he writes about the Black and Caribbean experience, but he also wrote a lot about neoliberalism and capitalism and how that functions. And he was the person that coined the term Thatcherism in one of his essays. So he's just a great thinker in many different areas. A good place to start would be, if you haven't heard his Desert Island Discs, I listen to that every now and again, because it's a really good entry point into what he has to say about the empire and the Caribbean.
Fantastic tip there. Afia.
I would recommend Rennie Edo-Lodge. She's written a brilliant book called Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. And I think she really breaks down Black British history and structural racism. She also has a podcast, and there's actually a summarized article on The Guardian. And I think she really captures the issues that Black British people face currently, but also have faced for many, many decades. So I would recommend her work.
Brilliant recommendation. Gian.
See, when you first asked me that question, I had loads of scholars that came to mind, but then I realized that they were not Black British, which I think is the issue. A lot of the scholars that I'm reading are American, and I think there's a lot of sort of American centrism in how we are studying Black lives and Black people. I do think from a lot of the readings I did through, funnily enough, migration and society as a module, I do think, Paul Gilroy's Black Atlantic is quite an amazing read, and is also very, very topical in terms of trying to understand why the events in America have affected the events in the UK, and how Black Atlantic identity can be looked at and should be seen as sort of a massive community in a sense. And I mean, there are problems in terms of how that is being done, in terms of that maybe we are essentializing too much American narratives. But I do think that the Black Atlantic does really, really explain and go into a lot of detail about how we've all had these sort of shared histories. And, Paul Gilroy is the director for the Center of the Study of Race and Racism at UCL. So I think it is important for UCL especially UCL students, to read his work and to understand, where UCL is going with hopefully that center, and hoping that more people would be interested in his work and joining that center and being part of doing further research.
Agree. I mean, Professor Paul Gilroy's work is phenomenal. It's just so important that we read kind of some of his contributions. Thank you for those recommendations. Before I wrap up, I just wondered, does anyone have anything else that they'd like to say or share with the listeners?
I have another recommendation. It's a TED Talk by Menno Fombo, and it's called No, You Can't Touch My Hair. And she's relaying her experiences growing up in a white area as a black girl, and the issue of hair and touching hair and not feeling like her hair complied with the norm. So I would recommend that. Not everyone is a book person, I recognize that. So I think if you like watch videos, that would be a great TED Talk to watch.
Thank you so much. Kian, did you want to say something?
Oh yeah, if I wanted to add to people that I think both black and non-black people should read, I think everyone should read more bell hooks. I think everyone should read more Frantz Fanon. And then I remember doing this essay on the ANC, the African National Congress in South Africa. And for some reason that I don't know how I deviated to American politics and scholars, but one of the co-founders of the Black Panther Party was Huey P. Newton. And he has some great work on world systems theory. And he coined a term called reactionary intercommunalism. And he also sort of went into revolutionary intercommunalism. And reactionary intercommunalism is this idea that the US has had this expansive power after the world wars, given the sort of decline of European imperial and colonial empires and stuff like that, and links. So I think that his work is really, really interesting and should be sort of regarded on the same level as a lot of other world systems theorists.
Thank you, Kian. And Jonathan, a final comment.
I was just going to shout out to Rokhaya Diallo, who is a French journalist and writer. So if you want to find out about what's going on in France, she's published a lot on The Guardian. She writes for Al Jazeera in English as well. And the Huffington Post, I think she's written for. And I think if you want to understand how issues of race in France, she would be my go-to person.
Thank you so much, Gian, Afia, and Jonathan, for being so open, for sharing your experiences, and for giving our listeners so much to think about. You can find the recommendations from these students on the IOE website. We'll leave the discussion for now with a snippet of actor and activist John Boyega's speech at the Black Lives Matter movement protest in Hyde Park, London, on the 3rd of June 2020. To me, his words capture the oppression that has gone on for too long and the change that needs to happen. I'm Humera Iqbal.
I ain't waiting. I have been born in this country. I'm 28 years old, born and raised in London. And for time, every black person understands and realizes the first time you are reminded that you are black. I need you to understand how painful this is. I need you to understand how painful it is. Guys. To be reminded every day that your race means nothing. And that isn't the case anymore. They want us to be disorganized, but not today.
Thanks so much for downloading and listening to this IOE podcast from the UCL Institute of Education, University College London.